Hi, everybody, and welcome to a recorded lecture. Today we're going to talk about the Great Depression and the biggest economic downturn in our country's history. It really wasn't that great. So please excuse my smiling face down in the corner. That's the picture I use for all of these. I should be really sad. It's the Great Depression. Don't make it sound like I'm really excited about economic catastrophe. I feel like I said a similar thing about slavery when we got there. But anyway, here is the agenda. So there's no real prime time attendance. I assume the sub got attendance. Thank you, sub. Prayer should have opened in prayer today. We're going to do the episode 4 of Grade 7.2. Today we're going to talk about the Great Depression. Your homework, should you choose to accept it, is to read chapter 21, the New Deal. And of course, don't forget about your DIY field trip. We have 3 objectives today. By the end of class today, you should be able to list the main causes of the Great Depression and discuss the effectiveness of the government's response by 1932. You should be able to outline Hoover's attempts to address economic problems. You should be able to explain the major public policy initiatives of the New Deal and President Roosevelt's first 100 days. Let's begin in Roman numeral number 21. In the summer of 1927, Calvin Coolidge was vacationing in the Black Hills of South Dakota. He was sort of an outdoorsy guy. He liked fly fishing and horseback riding, maybe because those are 2 solitary activities, and Coolidge was a solitary man. And he called a press conference there. When the reporters showed up, Coolidge handed each reporter a strip of paper that read, "I do not choose to run for president in 1928." After allowing the reporters to take that in, Coolidge said, "If I take another term, I'll be in the White House till 1933, and 10 years in Washington is longer than any other man has had it. It's too long." And so, without providing any further information, Coolidge remarked, "There'll be nothing left from this office today." It's about the most Coolidge way to ever do a press conference. The Secretary of State, Herbert Hoover, jumped at the chance to run for president. Hoover seemed to be like everything that was great about America. Herbert Hoover, even though today we don't remember him very well, historians have not been that kind to him, in his day was seen as an amazing man of ability. It was Herbert Hoover who led the European Relief Council during and after World War I that mostly kept an entire continent from starving to death, but he wasn't universally liked. The people that knew him most, he drove them crazy. Coolidge was reluctant to endorse Hoover as his successor, even though the same political party, they're both Republicans. One occasion he remarked, "For 6 years, that man has given me unsolicited advice, and all of it bad." But Herbert Hoover had an interesting story. He's in a lot of ways a success story. He grew up as an orphaned child. By adulthood, he was a multi-millionaire engineer with an international practice. Herbert Hoover was a world hero for his relief efforts during and after the Great War, where he fed 9 million Europeans a day through his coordinated relief efforts. It's interesting, he did it entirely tax-free. It was just by donations and the wise use of resources. He was considered a genius at basically everything, and both political parties hoped they would be their presidential candidate. In 1920, Franklin Roosevelt said our best bet would be to nominate Herbert Hoover. They didn't, and he eventually settled into the Republican Party. Hoover's opponent in 1928 was a guy named Al Smith. Al Smith of New York was a pro-business, pro-farm, pro-immigration reform, anti-war candidate, and they both were. But the really thing that people didn't like about Al Smith was that he was a Catholic. And this isn't just like St. James jingoism. It was actually a huge problem for Smith in the election. Catholicism of the day was a sort of obscure minority religion of immigrants. And the 2 candidates were otherwise so similar there wasn't much else to distinguish them. Herbert Hoover promised a chicken in every pot and a car in every garage and solidly beat Al Smith, carrying 40 states to Smith's 8 states. Farmers, every now and then, had been in trouble. And this is just kind of one of the natures about farming, that it's just sometimes there's good years to make a lot of money, and sometimes there's lean years and you don't make any money, and sometimes you lose money, and the goal is to break even in the long run. And so farmers here in the first part of the 20th century had been in trouble. Farmers made up around 50% of the population, and Calvin Coolidge seemed a little indifferent to their problems. His famous line was, "Farmers have never made much money, and I don't think there's anything anybody can do about it." So the farmers were having trouble, but then we see industry start to slow down too. Auto sales slowed down, and consumers had maxed out installment plans, which were the lines of credit they'd use to finance the rest of the economy. It was not uncommon for people to basically owe 100% of their net worth to others, and any financial analyst can tell you that is a sure sign of impending disaster. And if a person was an investor and played the stock market or even real estate investment, they could buy stock on margin, which would mean that they basically borrowed money to go buy stock, which encouraged speculation and basically gambling with net worth. It was stock market gambling. One of the theories of the Great Depression is that the average people and investors caused the Great Depression by taking on too much debt. There is, of course, a more complicated story there. That was about the nature of inflation and managing interest rates, but even low interest rates over time encourage people to take on too much debt. And this is a pretty classic case now, but it was poorly understood at the time. After a brief mini crash and recovery, the Dow Jones Industrial Average dropped 13% on Black Monday, and then that was October 28, 1929. And then the next day, it dropped another 12%. By November 13th, the market was down 50%, and all those people that had borrowed money to buy stocks suddenly found the stocks that they had purchased was worth less than they had, and they owed money on a depreciating asset, and this is how you ruin the stock market. Now, a common economic belief was that during economic hard times, countries should protect their own industries by raising tariffs. Tariffs, of course, are a tax on imports, and what they really do is protect domestic industry by making imports more expensive. So that's a common economic practice. during economic downturns, but it wasn't a universal belief, so particularly among the growing study of economics, which was a new and developing social science. And there, the thought was that if you increased imports, yes, you might overall have a negative effect on American industries, but you lower the cost of living, which is pretty handy in economic downturns because overall goods become cheaper. And despite 1,000 economists begging him not to, the president signed, Herbert Hoover signed what was called the Smoot-Hawley Tariff in 1930, which effectively killed international trade. The United States trade partners retaliated by raising their own tariffs, limiting U.S. exports, and even though we were protecting our own industries domestically, we ended up hurting our own industries on the international market. By July 8th of 1932, the stock market was down nearly 90%. And after the Smoot-Hawley tariff, unemployment jumped and the stock market plunged again. The crash of 1929 was blamed for causing the depression, but Smoot-Hawley is probably a greater blame of sustaining the impression. Now, the overall economy is more complex than one or two events, but I think we can look at those as pretty important pieces of the overall depression. By 1932, the American unemployment rose to 23.5%, where nearly 1 in 4 Americans was out of work. It had been just 3% 3 years before, so that's an amazing and seemingly catastrophic fall. People feared mass starvation and or revolution. Now, the Great Depression transformed American life. Hungry men and women lined the streets every day in search of work. In the city of Detroit, 4,000 children stood in bread lines every day looking for any kind of a public handout. Thousands of families lost their homes, and they oftentimes lived in shanty towns. Shanty towns are just sort of like sheds and outposts and not much more than a campsite that lived on the kind of the perimeters of the city, the peripheries of the city. And they became known as Hoovervilles. Now, there's a real famous historian. He's one of my favorite historians. That H.W. Brands argues that yes, we call them Hoovervilles. They might as well have just been called Rooseveltvilles because actually they happened largely during the Roosevelt administration. But Hoovervilles was easy to say, and Rooseveltvilles, that's too many syllables in it. But the image of big business, carefully cultivated in the 1920s, collapsed as congressional investigations received massive irregularities among bankers and stockholders, and it looked like business was corrupt, which had fed the problem. Now, for a long time, cities had seen decrease in population, but this is the first time that it ever happened in the United States. People moved to the country to try to grow food for their families, and large-scale cities saw drops in their populations. Rural areas, though, weren't any escape from the poverty, and in fact, maybe it even is worse into the rural areas. The birth rate fell, and the suicide rate became the highest in U.S. history. The government had promised long ago to go pay World War I veterans a bonus. If you had fought in World War I, part of the compensation package was the person would get a bonus in 1945, 27 years after the war ended, which would basically be for most soldiers about the time they were staring down retirement. But a few of them decided to go ask for their bonuses early, saying, well, I might not even be alive in 1945, plus, I need the money now, so they asked for their bonus early. Now, this was in the mid-1920s, and then Warren G. Harding, president at the time, had said no, first in 1921 and 1922, and then President Coolidge said the same thing. Congress said no again in 1924. By 1932, the soldiers were getting desperate. The Great Depression was really setting in, and a group of more or less of 43,000 World War I veterans traveled all the way to Washington, D.C. to protest. They wanted their bonus now. Herbert Hoover refused, citing the 1945 date, which was the date that agreed on, and there's certainly a justifiable case for that. Hoover was a compassionate man. It's very easy to paint him in this, cartoon picture that he just lets everybody starve, but that's not true. Remember, he did lead the great relief effort of Europe, but he believed that the bonus army marchers were actually communists trying to damage America, and communism seemed like an increasingly real threat. It looked like maybe it was succeeding the Soviet Union, and it looked like perhaps capitalism was in the collapse that Karl Marx had predicted. And then you have all of these, marchers on there, and the marchers are army veterans, so they're not armed soldiers, but they're trained soldiers, and now it appears that they're storming on the nation's capital to make demands that the government isn't prepared to make. Well, out of ultimately 4,800,000 veterans, around 43,000 showed up in Washington, D.C. And here, Hoover makes some pretty important mistakes. He sent in General Douglas MacArthur to peacefully restrain and disperse this bonus army, this army of people looking for their bonuses. They call them the bonus army. MacArthur exceeded his orders and used violence. He commanded an army regiment, and Major George Patton led a cavalry regiment. Patton led 6 battle tanks to monitor the bonus army protests. The bonus marchers said, hey, exciting, the military's here, the army is here. They'll come to support us because they thought they were veterans and the army would come along. When they cheered the troops until Patton ordered the cavalry to go charge the bonus army, the action which promised the spectators they were yelling on like, shame, shame. It appeared the United States Army was marching on their own veterans who was marching on their own capital, and this didn't go well for anybody. The cavalry charged. The infantry dropped fixed bayonets and tear gas, and they entered bonus army camps. There they evicted veterans and families and camp followers. Hoover said, whoa, 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 I order this dispersed and peacefully and not like lowering bayonets and charging into the crowd with the cavalry. Hoover ordered the assault stopped, but MacArthur ignored the president and ordered new attacks, claiming that the bonus march was an attempt, in fact, to overthrow the government. 55 veterans were injured, 135 were arrested. The public was outraged. Hoover could have and probably should have court-martialed MacArthur, but he didn't. That probably could have been the thing that saved Herbert Hoover's reelection, but he didn't. well, anyway, Roman numeral number 20. President Herbert Hoover had a response plan to the economy, and there was economics was an emerging field at the time. It wasn't like a settled social science. It's still not really a settled social science. They say if you put five economists in a room and ask them a question, they come out with seven answers. So it's still not even a settled thing. But particularly in the 1920s, it's a new field of study. And here I'd like to introduce you to John Maynard Keynes. This guy sitting in the chair here on the right side of the screen. John Maynard Keynes believed that when a country's economy stagnates, the way that the government should spur economic growth forward is through what's called counter-cyclical spending, or basically they should spend money that the government doesn't have. This is classic Keynesian economics here. John Maynard Keynes was very influential in the United States, even though he himself was British. He was very influential in the United States in the 1920s and the 1940s. We could argue that we are still largely in a Keynesian world today. Now, this was his plan that he pitched to Herbert Hoover, and Hoover was very cautious with Keynes's plan. He did basically put the idea of countercyclical economics in place, that when the economy goes down, you spur it on by spending government money. If industry itself won't spend money, then the government should. Just suddenly go pave some roads or something and just spend cash, and that'll put people back to work. But Hoover proceeded very slowly. Economists differed over the idea of countercyclical spending, and Hoover experimented with programs or responses. All of these were trying to get money circulating and stop deflation, which is where prices go down, which sounds good from a consumer. It's actually catastrophe in an economic system. But they experimented with these things, but Hoover received a lot of the blame for not being aggressive enough in his Keynesian stimulus. He did do some things, and let's talk about those. Construction began on Boulder Dam in 1931, which employed thousands of workers. A little over 100 of them died at a cost of $49 million. That would be still a pretty aggressive budget today at $836 million. They built the largest dam in the world at the time. Boulder Dam's Lake Mead, the lake that was created behind it, would provide irrigation resources and electricity from the turbines, which would go power Arizona and Nevada and California. In 1932, Hoover took another step. He created the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which would loan money to banks and railroads and other businesses. That was about the same time of the Federal Home Loan Bank Act, which would try to lower the cost of home ownership. In 1932, the Glass-Steagall Act was passed. Now, there would be a couple of those, but the first one we can credit Hoover for, Glass-Steagall Act, which was the goal was to stop deflation by helping the federal government make loans to banks, which would stabilize prices in the greater economy. International trade was on life support. Basically the Smoot-Hawley tariff had clobbered international trade so much that it was on life support, and Hoover intervened more. He told businesses to stop firing and layoffs and maintain as much staff as possible. He raised taxes to 64% in an effort to balance the budget, but this is a toxic combination of high taxes, high tariffs, lots of rules, and overregulated economy. Now, Hoover largely opposed direct relief. He didn't want to go, hand welfare directly to people. He was strongly committed to what was called associational action, whereupon private charities would provide relief instead of the government. He had a long career of helping people with this radical charity, but Hoover was never a believer in government handouts, believing that Americans should take care of other Americans rather than the American government to do so. Remember, he fed Europe through a volunteer program. But free marketers were also upset at Hoover's policies. Free marketers, Herbert Hoover didn't listen to his Secretary of the Treasury, the stone-eyed Andrew Mellon here in the bottom left corner. Mellon wanted to go handle the Depression in the 19th century, to handle the Depression in the 1920s in the 19th century sort of way, which was basically let businesses fail. Now, it's a cold medicine, but Mellon said liquidate labor, liquidate stocks, liquidate the farmers, liquidate real estate. It'll purge the rottenness out of the system. High costs of living and high living will come down. People will work harder. They will live a more moral life. The values will be adjusted. Enterprising people will pick up the wrecks from less competent people and basically let the tough medicine do its job. Now, Mellon's way is essentially what happened to the Great Depression in 1920 to 1921. Believers in free enterprise, they basically take this laissez-faire approach, the hands-off approach, let businesses fail, the economy will eventually recover, and more efficient businesses will come out of it. But that's tough medicine that's really hard to sell to the people. And Hoover ended up basically looking at Mellon and saying, Mellon wants to starve people. Herbert Hoover never wanted to do that. They didn't think alike, and Hoover fired Mellon. That takes us to Roman numeral number 23. Franklin Delano Roosevelt is an interesting guy. He, despite this picture in the right side, is not Mr. Lindgren, though he does look suspiciously like him. Roosevelt's family had been in America since before the Revolution. He was an established upper-crust family from Hyde Park, New York. He was handsome, charming, and rich. Basically, he was aristocracy, or as much as we have that in the United States. He was also this guy that was perpetually optimistic, and how could you not be when you're handsome, charming, and rich? He spoke German, he spoke French, he spoke English, he was an accomplished sailor, he was a good golfer, he was an average student, but an average student in Harvard. He was a Harvard man. Theodore Roosevelt, the 26th president, was his fifth cousin and his role model and hero. He basically even wore the same kind of glasses as Teddy. He wanted to be an energetic reformer like cousin Teddy did. Now, at age 20, he married his cousin, Eleanor Roosevelt. They were fifth cousins. It's weird. Her maiden name was also Roosevelt, so she's Eleanor Roosevelt. Anyway, they had 6 kids. At some point, the marriage became an unhappy one. At some point, they fell out of love. And FDR had an affair with Lucy Mercer, this woman over here in the left side. Lucy Mercer was Eleanor's secretary, so that's awkward. There was also a suspected affair with Marguerite Lahand, which was his secretary. There's also evidence of an affair with Princess Martha of Sweden, who lived at the White House when Germany invaded Norway. Eleanor took all of this not exactly in stride. She wrote that she could forgive, but she couldn't forget. She considered divorce and to leave FDR, but the Roosevelt family said it was a scandal that hurt the family name, and so for family obligation reasons, the marriage held together. In 1921, he became crippled due to polio. Polio is an infectious disease that causes muscle weakening and skeletal deformity and paralysis. He spent more or less the rest of his life in wheelchairs, but many years visiting with endless doctors who would exercise, doing anything he could to walk again. He never actually walked again. It's sort of a sad story how this goes, but he was always, he basically didn't want anybody to know it. He never admitted to the public that he was crippled until just really a few months before he died. He had braces built into his legs. You can sort of see the braces coming out of the bottom of his feet right there, which would lock his legs together, and he could, with the help of some guards, sort like holding him up, sort of do a fake walk shuffle. He was always he was always standing. Like Teddy Roosevelt, he became an assistant secretary to the Navy. In 1928, at age 23, he was the Democratic Party's candidate for vice president. There, they got stomped by Harding in that year. In 1930, he was elected to governor of New York, like Teddy was. In 1932, he ran for president. He looked incredibly energetic, but it might have not been exactly clear on what he was going to do as president. He had all this stuff that sounds bold, but has no details to it. The country demands bold, persistent experimentation. It's common sense to take a method and try it, and if it fails, admit it frankly and try another, but above all, try something. And so that's what he did. In the 1932 election, FDR promised what he called a new deal for the American people. His campaign was vague in explaining how he was going to do so. Now, U.S. economic problems were at this point rippling across the globe. Europe had faced its own Great Depression. There were conservative and totalitarian leaders which were moving through Europe in the 1930s. People were turning to communism and or fascism for answers. This is one of the things that is like a benchmark piece of American history. When people feel desperate for answers, they turn to people who promise answers. Whether or not they're good answers or bad answers, they all at least sound like answers. And that's what we were watching with Europe in the 1930s, that in the hardest times, it looked like somebody could provide clarity in this time of crisis. Now, on the other side of the Atlantic, back in the United States, back on the ranch, Roosevelt was seeing this New Deal as an alternative to socialism on the left, or Nazism on the right, or to the inaction of the upholders of the revolution. And for his advice, FDR relied very heavily on a group of intellectuals and social workers who would take up key positions in his administration. You might, some of these people are really worth knowing about. The first person we'll talk about is the Secretary of Labor, Frances Perkins. Frances Perkins, U.S. Secretary of Labor. She's the longest serving labor secretary. She's the first woman to be appointed to the cabinet, U.S. Labor Secretary Frances Perkins. She'd actually worked at the Hull House with Jane Addams and had been an eyewitness to the Triangle Fire, which was an industrial accident that caused a whole bunch of deaths in New York. Another person appointed by Roosevelt was Harry Hopkins. He headed the emergency relief during FDR's time as governor of New York and served as a personal advisor to the president. And we also see our old friend Louis Brandeis was offering political advice from the Supreme Court of the United States, even though we expect the Supreme Court is not political. There are people in there and they have their affiliations. Now, in 1933, Roosevelt spent a lot of his time trying to reassure the public, trying to talk America out of panic. And a lot of the banks in particular were particularly unhealthy. In 1929 and 1933, a bank was closing one a week. This is dramatic. Today in the United States, there are 2 or 3 bank closures nationwide in a year. That's very rare that banks fail today. For however many thousands of banks there are, it's a very small failure rate. But from 1929 to 1933, there was at least one a week in the United States. When banks close, depositors might not get their money back. So they put the money in the bank, and all of a sudden the bank goes out of business, and everybody that had money in the bank just loses it. Well, in this atmosphere, banks tended to not lend money to each other, because what happens if, Millbury Savings Bank loads their money to Goliath National Bank, which happens all the time, and then Goliath goes out of business, and Millbury has lost somebody else's money in somebody else's bank account, bank crash. Roosevelt saw all this panic, and he declared what was called a bank holiday. And the bank holiday was ordered by the Emergency Banking and Relief Act, which closed the banks until people learned which ones were solvent, which means healthy, and then slowly let the good banks back open again. This was something that was entirely extra-constitutional. The president doesn't have the authority to just go and close banks, but the Emergency Banking and Relief Act, he basically took control of the banking system in order to head off panic to do so. They also put the FDIC in place. The FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, means that even if the bank goes broke, depositors still get their money back. So at the time, it was $2,500. So you could put $2,500 into the bank, and even if the bank went out of business, you know that you was guaranteed, and you could get your money back out. Today, instead of $2,500, it's $250,000. If you have $250,001 in that account, you don't get that last dollar back, so you just open another account at a separate bank and put the one in there. At the time, the United States went off the gold standard. If The gold standard, remember bimetallism of William Jennings Bryan, where he wanted 2 metals in competition for stabilizing the economy. In the United States went off the gold standard of the 1930s, believing that, yes, we should go encourage inflation. The nice thing about the gold standard is that it heads off inflation largely because you can't just create more money unless you just go find more gold. But if you go off the gold standard, then you can encourage inflation by just printing some more money. And that would stimulate the economy. You can look that up in what's called the Phillips curve. And there was an unprecedented flurry of legislation during the first 3 months of Roosevelt's administration in what became known as the 100 Days. The first one I want to talk about is the National Recovery Administration, or the NRA, but not that NRA, a different NRA, the National Recovery Administration. It was Roosevelt's plan for combating the Depression, creating an administration to establish rules to regulate what he called cutthroat competition and promote fair business practices. The goal of the NRA was to help workers by setting a minimum wage, to set weekly maximum hours, and not let products be sold for less than minimum prices. He put in there retired General Hugh Johnson to set the standards for production and prices and wages in textile, steel, mining, auto industries, and he launched a publicity campaign for businesses to cooperate with the NRA, and to do so they would get the rights to put up a big Blue Eagle logo. Its purpose was not to disrupt competition. That was not the purpose, or to end disruptive competition, but to basically take these large corporations, which had dominated the code writing process and allowed them to drive up prices and stress their competition and bankrupt them, and then that was the goal. The goal was to end that type of competition. The Supreme Court killed the NRA in 1935, so the president had taken too much power for himself, and it's kind of hard to argue. Otherwise, the policies reappeared later in other acts. Politically, they were created and favored labor unions, which became a large part of what was later called the New Deal coalition, and held together as a solid block of Democratic voters for more than 30 years. The 100 Days also brought the government into providing relief, and we'll get all right, so this phase in American history, it's easy to roll out all of the New Deal policies as this alphabet soup of everything is a 3 or 4 letter acronym. So there's dozens and dozens of these that were proposed by the Roosevelt administration. We're just going to hit kind of a few of the more famous ones. First, the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, or FERA, made grants to local agencies who would aid the poor. There's also the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, which took unemployed young men to work on projects like forest preservation or flood control, or the improvement of national parks or wildlife reserves. There's also the Public Works Administration, the PWA, which built roads and bridges and highways and schools and hospitals and public facilities. And of course, the world famous TVA. The TVA was the Tennessee Valley Authority, which built a series of series of darns, it's a Catholic school, to prevent floods and deforestation along the Tennessee River and provide cheap electric power for homes and factories in the region, which basically, a lot of people in the upper South were living in non-electrified log cabins, but it's the 20th century and they should be able to plug in their stuff. The Agricultural Adjustment Act authorized the federal government to raise farm prices by setting production quotas for major crops and then paying farmers to not plant more to try to control the supply and demand. The AAA succeeded in significantly raising farm prices and income for large farmers, but it hurt small farms and tenant farmers. Basically, it sort of conspired against the smallest pieces, the smallest fish in the pool. The 1930s also witnessed severe drought, creating the Dust Bowl, ruining agriculture in Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, and Colorado. It became the setting for John Steinbeck's work, The Grapes of Wrath, which as a piece of literature doesn't super hold up today, but it was very important to people of the era, about the Joad family, J-O-A-D, the Joad family, who were basically farmers from Oklahoma whose life dried up and they moved west to go try to find a better life. The Grapes of Wrath, John Steinbeck, Joad family, Great Depression. Anyway, home ownership had become a mark of respectability, but the Great Depression devastated the American housing economy. The Hoover administration established a federally sponsored bank to try to issue home loans, but Franklin Roosevelt moved more energetically to protect homeowners from foreclosure. He also wanted to stimulate new construction with things like the Homeowners Loan Corporation and Federal Housing Administration. There were other important measures of Roosevelt's first years in office. He passed the 21st Amendment, repealing prohibition, saying that it's kind of indecorous here, but he said that basically all these years of the Depression, America could use a drink, so they repealed prohibition. The FCC was the Federal Communications Commission, which was started to regulate the telephone and radio industries in the public interest, and then the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, was there to regulate stock and bond markets to try to get them to work in the public interest as well. When you finish the slide, you may save and close your notes. Jesus saves, and so should you.